Oral questions. The honourable member from Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's good friend and head of revenue for the Liberal Party, Stephen Bronfman, was named in the Paradise Papers. Earlier this week, the Revenue Minister promised a full investigation into those exposed in these documents. Can the Minister confirm to this House that Liberal Party insider Stephen Bronfman is included in this and is currently under investigation?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. In our first two budgets, we invested nearly $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. And our plan is producing results. We're targeting 4 jurisdictions per year. We are hiring 100 new auditors. We've had 627 cases transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants executed, 78 convictions. We've looked at the rules for voluntary disclosure. We've imposed $44 million in penalties for tax prep.
Mr. Speaker, specificity does matter in this case. The Minister promised an independent investigation. However, this morning, the Prime Minister defended his good friend and his top fundraiser, stating that he is satisfied with the assurances that he's received from Mr. Bronfman. The Prime Minister's political interference on behalf of his close friend is a clear signal to investigators that there's one rule for Liberals and another one for everyone else. Can the Minister confirm that the Prime Minister has pardoned Mr. Bronfman of any wrongdoing?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is aware of the fact that this is an issue worth many millions of dollars, and we have made investments of nearly $1 billion to fight against tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you, and I can tell all Canadians listening to us today, that as Minister of National Revenue, no one is above the law.
Member for Milton.
Tell the Prime Minister. The Minister did confirm that a full investigation will be undertaken with regards to the people named. She has confirmed it right now. But today, the Prime Minister publicly interfered with this investigation, stating that he would accept Mr. Bronfman's explanation and considered the matter to be dealt with. Is this how it works now? You're a wealthy friend of the Prime Minister, hiding millions of dollars offshore. You pick up the phone, you give him a call, and the issue goes away. Can the Minister confirm that Stephen Bronfman is not under investigation by the Canada Revenue Agency?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and tax avoidance. And the opposition knows well, Mr. Speaker, that as Minister of National Revenue, I cannot comment on any particular case. What I can say is that we've invested nearly $1 billion over the last 2 years, unlike the Conservative government, who spent 10 years doing absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker. And even a former Minister of National Revenue, Jean-Pierre Blackburn, publicly stated that this was not a priority for the Conservatives. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, we learned that one of the Prime Minister's good friends, Stephen Bronfman, was named in the Paradise Papers. The Minister of National Revenue promised there would be an independent investigation into these documents. But today, the Prime Minister says that he's satisfied with his friend's explanation. His friend, the big fundraiser of the Liberal Party of Canada. Can the Minister of Revenue simply tell us if she agrees with her Prime Minister and that there should be no investigation? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague across the way to give me the opportunity to tell Canadians who are listening everything that our government has done over the last 2 years. What have we done for Canadian families, Mr. Speaker? Canadian families who are in need of support. Well, we've given them the Canada Child Benefit, Mr. Speaker. We've given more money to families. We've worked with low-income workers so that they can keep more of their hard-earned money by increasing the working income tax benefit. And we've increased that up to $500 million. We've also changed Harper's reform of the EI system. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Order. Well, the Minister can repeat her talking points, but we're not stupid. The Prime Minister intervened on behalf of his close friend, and this is a clear signal to investigators that there's one set of rules for Liberals and another for all tax-paying Canadians. The Prime Minister says that he's satisfied with his friend's explanation. The Liberal Party's fundraiser, who use tax havens to avoid paying taxes like all other Canadians. Is there any member on the other side of the House who will have the courage to stand up and call out this unacceptable situation? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I think that my colleague across the way is repeating the same thing, and perhaps he needs to hear the good news that I have to say again. As for myself as Minister of National Revenue and for the Prime Minister and our government, it's important to fight tax evasion and tax avoidance. That was a priority for us, and it still is. We've invested nearly $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, and that is yielding results. We are targeting 4 jurisdictions per year. We're hiring more than 100 new auditors. We have 627 cases that have been transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants executed. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet et Miscotelebas.
Tomorrow, the NDP will ask the Finance Committee to investigate the Paradise Papers and to call on Stephen Brafman and former Liberal Senator Leo Colbert to explain to Canadians where their names, their firms and their trusts are linked to tax havens. And we hope that the Liberal majority will support us because the Prime Minister might be satisfied with the explanations, but Canadians are not. The Prime Ministers like to say that sunshine is the best disinfectant. Liberals will have a chance to show it. Are they going to support an investigation, or are they going like they've done for the last 2 years and block it?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, the government is aware that this is an issue worth many millions of dollars, and we have made historic investments over the last 2 years. The agency now has the tools to look into 100% of tax returns of all of the big multinational companies every year. This allows the agency to identify wealthy individuals and companies that may be participating in such schemes. No one is above the law. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Well, that wasn't exactly the question, but former Senator Colbert and the big fundraiser, Mr. Brafman, are involved in a multi-million-dollar trust in the Cayman Islands. This is serious. Tax havens are causing us to lose billions of dollars per year, and they're increasing inequality. The Paradise Papers have revealed many things, but not all. To get to the bottom of this, the NDP has tabled a motion to invite these 2 individuals to appear before the Finance Committee to answer our questions. Will the Liberals vote for our motion and show that they have nothing to hide? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and tax avoidance, and we've taken actions over the last 2 years that demonstrate that. As far as the committee is concerned, Mr. Speaker, committees are the master of their own domain. They're free to make their own choices, and I will respect that. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, let me quote, Mr. Bronfman did nothing wrong. There's no rich Canadian who wouldn't try to diversify their assets abroad. Who said that? The Liberal member for Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel. Next quote. There are people using a legal system, and then they confirmed that they used a legal system. Who said that? The Liberal member for Montarville. The Prime Minister says he's satisfied with Stephen Bronfman's explanations. Is that why the Liberals aren't tackling tax havens? Because they think that it's normal that their millionaire friends don't pay taxes? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, during the last election campaign, the Liberal government was very clear in its platform. We said we would work against tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. And over the last 2 years, we've invested historic sums, which was not done during the previous 10 years, Mr. Speaker. Nearly $1 billion have been invested, which has allowed us to target 4 jurisdictions per year, to hire 100 auditors. We've also laid criminal charges, Mr. Speaker. And if you look, there were 37 convictions in the last year for more than 50 years in prison.
Squatale.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nézetti-Squatale-Basque. Well, what she's not saying is that there's only $40 million that have actually been invested. Now, if we ask the member for Montarville and Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel, perhaps they should ask their citizens if they're happier paying more tax than people like Mr. Bronfman and Mr. Colbert.
I mean that it's moral, and it's legal only because generations of liberal and conservative governments have made the laws that made it legal. We are the House of Commons, and we can change laws. The question is, will the government do it, or will they block any initiative like they've done in the last 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. Now, that $1 billion that was given to the Canada Revenue Agency is for a period of 5 years, Mr. Speaker. This is public funds from people's taxes paid by citizens. And we are very careful, Mr. Speaker, about the way in which we spend taxpayer money. We want to make sure it's done right, and we are getting results, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 years, we've had 4 jurisdictions targeted each year.
Alors,
Order. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Minister of National Revenue just said something very interesting. She said that as Minister, she cannot comment on specific cases. Oh, yeah? Does the Minister know that her boss, the Prime Minister, didn't feel embarrassed about commenting on Stephen Bronfman's case? That's what's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister says there's no problem with Stephen Bronfman. Can the Minister call the Prime Minister and say, hey, maybe you should mind your own business? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. Our investments over the last 2 years show this very clearly. But I'd also like to tell my colleague across the way all of the things that our government has done over the last 2 years. We strengthened the Canada Child Benefit for families who needed it the most, Mr. Speaker. We lowered taxes for the middle class. We are working on lowering taxes for small businesses, Mr. Speaker. We've abolished the Harper reform, which targeted people who were receiving EI. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's not that that's not interesting, but it just doesn't answer our question. The Minister of Revenue said that there was an investigation into the Paradise Papers. Well, one of the people mentioned in the Paradise Papers is the big bag man of the Liberal Party, Stephen Bronfman, who's a longtime friend of the Prime Minister. Can the Minister finally confirm to Canadians that Stephen Bronfman and all Canadians named in the Paradise Papers will be investigated? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, as the member across the way knows very well, I will not be commenting on any individual case. Not today, not tomorrow, and not later. This is an issue of the credibility of the Canada Revenue Agency. The confidentiality of all of these files is a priority for the agency, Mr. Speaker.
the honourable member for Edmonton Manning and others not to be talking when it isn't their turn, when they don't have the floor. Because they know we have rules on this, of course. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Well, maybe the Minister of Revenue didn't hear the news that this morning the Prime Minister commented on this case, and in fact, he declared Bronfman innocent of all wrongdoing. Just days, in fact, after this minister announced an investigation, the Prime Minister shockingly said that his billionaire buddy and chief Liberal bagman is innocent and pure as the driven snow. Listen. Does the Prime Minister, it seems like the Minister of Revenue recognizes that this is wrong. Does the Prime Minister recognize how irresponsible and reckless it is for him to unilaterally say Stephen Bronfman is innocent?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. We want to ensure that our tax system is fair and equitable for all Canadians. And that's why I'm very proud of the leadership role that the agency has played on the international stage. We've collaborated with different tax organizations, including for the sharing of tax information. This is an essential tool to protecting the integrity of Canada's tax base. This is why the agency has more than 990 audits and 42 criminal investigations going on concerning international structures.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's reckless words and actions have placed the Revenue Minister in an untenable and an impossible position. The Minister stated that her department is investigating this matter, but before the investigation could barely begin, the Prime Minister has already made his finding of innocence. Wow. This irresponsible behaviour is indefensible. Did anyone advise the Prime Minister of the legal implications of what he just did?
Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. I've said it before and I'll repeat it. I'm very proud of the leadership role that we've taken on the international stage. And I'll say it again, Mr. Speaker. The agency has made historic investments, and this has allowed us to target 4 jurisdictions per year, to have criminal investigations underway. And, Mr. Speaker, no one is above the law. The laws apply to everyone, Mr. Speaker, regardless of one's status in Canada.
Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Speaker, the Prime Minister knows all about investigations. After all, he's under investigation for having broken the rules on his private island getaway, but that hasn't stopped him from interfering in the investigation of his billionaire fundraising friend, Stephen Bronfman, who's been implicated in the Paradise Papers. How can Canadians trust these Liberals to investigate their fundraising friends when the Prime Minister's already appointed himself judge and jury and has issued the acquittal?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and tax avoidance. And Mr. Speaker, the hypocrisy of our colleagues across the way is really quite stunning. When a former Minister of National Revenue from the Conservative government publicly states that this wasn't even a priority to look into tax havens, I don't think that they should be giving us any lessons. They shouldn't be teaching me or the government anything. Canadians expect a fair and equitable tax system, and that is what we're delivering.
Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Mr. Speaker, we can understand the Liberals don't like these investigations into their ethics. The Finance Minister has already been found guilty of breaking the Ethics Code by the Ethics Commissioner, and the Prime Minister is under investigation as well. And now the Prime Minister's undermined an active investigation into Liberal billionaire fundraiser Stephen Bronfman. So how can Canadians trust this Liberal government to conduct an impartial investigation when they're more interested in protecting their friends than finding the truth?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, in our first year, we invested nearly $1 billion for the first term. We have a plan, and it is producing results. We are targeting 4 jurisdictions per year. We are working at finalizing the hiring of 100 new auditors. We have 627 cases that have been transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants executed, and 78 convictions. We've tightened the rules for the proactive disclosure program. We have $44 million in fines that have been imposed on people who prepare tax returns. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I imagine the government is just as strongly committed to the fight against climate change. But Canada always seems to be like the dunce on the international stage when it comes to fighting climate change. According to the UN, member countries need to show a high level of urgency if we are to meet our Paris targets. Yesterday, the minister took a leading role in congratulating Nicaragua and Syria for joining the Paris Agreement, while her own government won't meet its targets. Can the minister put aside her talking points and tell us what she plans to do additionally to meet these targets? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his question. Of course, we are committed to fighting climate change. I was so proud to see the Prime Minister with the provincial and territorial premiers announcing our plan. we are going to be putting a price on carbon, we are going to be phasing out carbon, and we are going to be making historic investments in clean infrastructure and public transit. And I am very pleased that I will be in Bonn next week, where I will be working with representatives of the entire world to fight on this issue.
For Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, Canada announced $2.65 billion over 5 years to support efforts for the poorest and most vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change. Well welcomed, this promise delivers just a portion of Canada's fair share. This week, leading into COP22, the OECD criticized Canada for failing to deliver on even its meager target to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Will the Liberals commit today to real action on our nation's promises to act on climate change?
Here, here. The Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are all in when it comes to climate action. We understand that we need to be taking action, that we have an economic opportunity to do this, and that we have an obligation to our children. I'm very pleased that I'll be in Bonn next week, where I'll be working with countries around the world. We know that we need to be helping support the poorest countries who are fearing the impacts of climate change, many countries which will be underwater should we not stay under 2 degrees. We will be supporting them. We will be working with them. And I wish the party opposite would understand how important it is to listen and take action against climate change.
Order. Most members in all parties are able to sit through question period, hear things they don't always like, and yet not react. Remember, and the public doesn't like it all when they hear that kind of thing. So I would ask the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands and others not to react and not to interrupt. The honourable member for Carleton.
Earlier today, the Revenue Minister said that it is inappropriate for ministers to comment on individual tax cases. She said she will not comment today, tomorrow, or later because the credibility of CRA is at stake.
Yes.
Yet, her boss, the Prime Minister, did exactly that. He publicly exonerated Stephen Bronfman, his top fundraiser, who may be under CRA investigation as part of the leaks into the Paradise Papers. Can the honourable member assure us that CRA will ignore the Prime Minister's directive to acquit Mr. Bronfman?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, the historic investments that were made in the Canada Revenue Agency, nearly $1 billion, show the extent to which we are committed to fighting tax evasion and avoidance. Our government has made efforts to allow the agency to tighten the rules for wealthy Canadians who are not paying their fair share. And we will go after people who exploit loopholes. There have been $44 million of fines, Mr. Speaker, against financial advisors, and there are also criminal investigations underway.
Member for Carleton.
The minister mentions criminal investigations that are underway. Her department announced that it is doing a full review as to whether to pursue such investigations against 3,000 people named in the Paradise Papers, one of whom is the Liberal Party's top fundraiser. But the Prime Minister, the head of the entire government, has already exonerated him and signaled down to CRA that he did nothing wrong. I ask again, will the minister direct CRA to ignore the Prime Minister's political interference in this case?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, in just the last fiscal year, we've had 37 convictions for more than 50 years in prison and $10 million in fines that were imposed by the courts. Thanks to this government's actions, in 2018, Canada may be able to exchange information automatically with other countries in order to identify taxpayers that have accounts abroad. As I said, Mr. Speaker, no one is above the law.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, while the Prime Minister protects his wealthy friends from paying taxes, we learned yesterday in the Finance Committee that this government continues to target people with diabetes with higher taxes. Diabetes Canada testified that this government knew 4 months ago that the tax department was stripping away the disability tax credit from type 1 diabetics, and to this day they're not aware of a single person who's had their credit reinstated. Why is this government targeting hardworking Canadians and suffering diabetics with higher taxes while letting top Liberal fundraisers off scot-free.
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to ensuring that all Canadians receive the credits and benefits that they are entitled to. The eligibility for this credit has not changed, Mr. Speaker. It's important to recognize that far too many Canadians live with these problems and need help. We are allowing low-income workers to keep more of their money, more of their hard-earned money, by increasing the working income tax benefit up to $500 million per year starting in 2019. We are continuing to deliver the merchandise just as we promised to our middle class.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Diabetes Canada said at the Finance Committee that the Canada Revenue Agency is refusing to release valuable information that would help determine the impact of the mass refusal of disability tax credit for diabetics. Now, diabetics have to pry, pull, and rip the information out of the minister's hands just to prove their case. Why won't the minister release this information, or does she have something to hide?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to ensuring that all Canadians receive the credits and benefits that they are entitled to. We are moving forward with a national law for persons with disabilities that will eliminate barriers and focus on accessibility for all Canadians living with a disability. We have facilitated access to tax credits, and the amounts being given are the highest that have ever been given in history, Mr. Speaker. We have simplified the forms for tax credits. We have hired specialized nurse practitioners and have allowed them to fill out forms.
Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. CBC has reported that public servants at the Miramichi Pay Centre are working in a toxic environment. These workers deal with understaffing, a lack of training, and little support. Hard-working, experienced public servants are crucial to solving the Liberals' pay system debacle. The Liberals don't seem to understand that workers need the proper tools to fix this fiasco. When will the government help these workers so that hard-working Canadians can get paid?
Minister of Public Services and Procurement.
On day 2 of my new job as Public Service and Procurement Minister, I was with the Prime Minister in Miramichi meeting the hard-working public servants who are leaving no stone unturned to make sure their colleagues get paid, and we are doing everything to support them. Their health and well-being as they pursue this goal is of paramount importance to us, and we are doing everything we can to support them in that endeavour. Thank you.
Député de Jonquière.
Honourable Member for Jonquière. According to a CBC report, we learned today that in addition to having to live with this government's Phoenix fiasco, the public servants in Miramichi say that the work environment at the pay centre is toxic. There's a lack of training, they're understaffed, and there's no support to answer employees' questions. And I could go on. These public servants are managing the pay centre, and they are managing the pay of 2/3 of public servants. When will the Liberals give them the resources that they need so that they can do their job right? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, on day 2 of my job as Minister of Public Works and Procurement, I was in Miramichi to meet with public servants and to solve the Phoenix problem. This is of primary importance of us for government, and we will not stop until we have fixed this problem.
Monsieur le Président, nous...
Mr. Speaker, we know that the problem of sexual harassment and sexual violence are unacceptable in any environment. As we saw in the report released last week, far too many people are victims of harassment or sexual violence at work.
Can the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour please update this House on actions taken by our government to make workplaces safer for all Canadians?
Good job, Minister.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we know that sexual violence and harassment are simply unacceptable.
The very first step towards making our workplaces and federally regulated industries and Parliament Hill free from harassment and sexual violence. No government, however, can eradicate harassment and sexual violence alone. We live in a culture, especially here, where power imbalances and gender norms create tolerance for these unacceptable behaviours. And I look forward to working with everyone here and throughout the federally regulated sectors to ensure that all Canadians are safe at work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, with great power comes great privilege for the Liberals. The Minister of National Revenue is talking about the past 2 years. Okay, vacation on a private island, a villa in France, profits in numbered companies, and the chief Liberal bagman who's sheltering millions in the Cayman Islands. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, what is shameful is that people with diabetes are being denied arbitrarily their tax credits. The Prime Minister is turning a blind eye to tax avoidance in his own circles while emptying the wallets of the most vulnerable. When will he give them back the tax credits they're entitled to? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government also has a much more concrete and successful record than that former government. Canadian families in need are receiving the Canada Child Benefit, which will allow them tangible support. It allows low-income workers to keep more of their hard-earned money by increasing the working income tax benefit by $500 million per year as of 2019. We've also eliminated the Harper EI reform, and we are committed to lowering taxes for small businesses as of 2019.
Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Finance Committee learned that the wait time for a decision on the disability tax credit has recently gone from about 3 weeks to over 40 weeks, and that since October 26th, all applications have been frozen. We also heard that refunds are being delayed and that the application form was changed based on this minister's belief that most type 1 diabetics do not qualify. One simple question, Mr. Speaker: when will this minister stop saying that nothing has changed?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government has committed to ensuring that everyone receives the tax credits that they are entitled to and the benefits that they're entitled to as well. The eligibility for this credit has not changed, Mr. Speaker. I repeat, the eligibility for this tax credit has not changed. It is true that far too many Canadians are living with difficulties and need help, and that is why our government has always taken a human approach to help those people who need it. Canadian families in need will be receiving the CCB earlier than anticipated.
Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, I have constituents who are already receiving letters from the Canada Revenue Agency informing them that they no longer are eligible for the disability tax credit. Now, you think that's bad, but it gets even worse. Now the minister is threatening to take money directly out of their bank accounts. Whoa. She's clawing back $6,000 from one constituent already. We know that the minister knows this is happening and has okayed it. Why are the Liberals going after the disabled Canadians and the middle-class families that look after them? When is this foolishness going to stop?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives across the way should stop saying things that are not true. The government is committed to ensuring that all Canadians receive the credits and the benefits that they're entitled to. We are moving forward with a national statute on persons with disabilities that will put the focus on accessibility for all Canadians with disabilities. And I'd like to remind my colleagues across the way that I was a social worker for 25 years, Mr. Speaker. I worked with people who had health problems, people who were underprivileged.
Order. Sarnia Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, Diabetes Canada testified yesterday that they've been trying to get a meeting with this minister to discuss devastating changes to the disability tax credit that renders 80% of applicants ineligible. The minister's own officials confirmed what we've been saying. The minister made a change to the process in May without consultation or notification to vulnerable Canadians. With Diabetes Canada here today, can the minister commit to meeting and hearing about their concerns directly, or will she continue her heartless attack on diabetics?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to ensuring that people receive the credits and benefits that they are entitled to, and I'd like to reassure my colleague across the way that we are working continuously with all our departments. We work with our partners and meet with them regularly, and I would also like to say that the eligibility for this credit has not changed, Mr. Speaker. The rules remain the same. They apply in exactly the same way. The Act is the same. Nothing has changed, Mr. Speaker. Deputy. The Honourable Minister for Salaberry-sur-Roi. The Prime Minister is currently in Hanoi for the APEC summit. There are over 100 political prisoners in Vietnam, including top human rights advocates such as Phan Kim Can or another blogger who is known as Mother Mushroom, and she's only 24 years old, and yet she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The U.S., Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Canadian Vietnamese organizations are calling for actions to be taken immediately. Will the Prime Minister intercede with the Vietnamese government to obtain their release? Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, one of the commitments that this government took when it was elected is to advocate for human rights in all our international relations. Obviously, this is an opportunity for our Prime Minister and our Minister in Vietnam to discuss the human rights situation in that region, and we do so every time that we have the opportunity. And during this visit, there will be conversations on this topic.
Port Moody Coquitlam.
Today marks day 76 of occupation of 2 open net salmon farms in the Broughton Archipelago. These coastal First Nations never agreed to open net salmon farms in their traditional territories. If the Liberals are serious about recognizing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then this is the time to show it. Will the minister meet with BC and First Nation governments to discuss moving these farms off wild salmon migration routes? Yes. Simple question, yes or no?
Yes. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, the simple answer is yes. Every time I'm in British Columbia and often in Ottawa, I meet with representatives of the provincial government, with Indigenous leaders. We often talk about the importance of aquaculture, of science, of investment, of wild Pacific salmon, what we can do to implement the recommendations of the Cohen Commission. And Mr. Speaker, with my colleagues in the Liberal caucus from British Columbia, we also talk about those important issues all the time, and I want to tell the member we understand and accept the concerns and are working with the British Columbia government.
Honourable Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Meanwhile, back to the finance minister's illegal and unethical activity. For 2 years, he hid behind an ethical screen controlled by his political staff. For 2 years, he hid tens of millions in Morneau Chappelle stock in Alberta, profiting from decisions he was making. For 2 years, he hid his French corporation from the ethics commissioner who found him guilty for non-disclosure. The minister still owns numbered companies, and what those assets are remains a mystery. Since apparently sunlight is the best disinfectant, will the finance minister pull the curtain back and let the sun shine in so Canadians can look inside what's in his other numbered companies?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that, as all members of this House do, I've disclosed all of my assets to the Ethics Commission and will continue to do so. What it does, Mr. Speaker, it allows us to get on with the work that we're doing. And I'm particularly pleased to tell this House that we've passed 500,000 jobs created since we've come into office. Mr. Speaker, I'm also pleased to say that the growth that we've experienced over the last year, the best growth in a decade, is making a real difference for Canadian families. They're doing better. They're putting more money into the economy, and we are all better.
Honorable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, after saying for weeks that he had followed the rules of the Ethics Commissioner, the Finance Minister was found guilty of having hidden his French corporation. And he also hid his shares for 2 years in numbered companies and benefited to the tune of millions of dollars. And while regulating an industry that he is supposed to do is impartially as a minister. Upholding the highest standards of honesty and impartiality? I don't think so, even though it's in the mandate letter. So, Mr. Speaker, why do the Liberals believe that they're above the law? Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I am working with, and I will continue to work with, the Ethics Commissioner. That is something that is very important. That is how we can be clear. It is clear that we are working for Canadians. That is our goal. We have excellent news for Canadians to date. Over the past 2 years, we have created 500,000 new jobs in our country. That is very important for our economy. It is very important for Canadian families. Our economy is working, Mr. Speaker. That is good news.
Exotic islands. We remember Bell Island, where the Prime Minister took the Liberal Party president and insiders. The Ethics Commissioner is looking into that. There's the Cayman Islands, where the Liberal Party's bagman has an offshore trust. CRA is looking into that. There's the Bahamas, the Barbados, where the Finance Minister has family companies. The Ethics Commissioner is looking into that. So many characters having island adventures. The Prime Minister's nickname should be Gilligan. Mr. Speaker. When will this Prime Minister and his skipper stop working for Liberal insiders and start working for Canadians?
Order. 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 We all love a little comedy, but let's settle down. Order. Order.
Order.
The
Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, that's what we promised to Canadians during the election campaign, and we keep our promises, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what we're doing, what we've been doing for the past 2 years at the CRA. There have been historic amounts that were invested to fight tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance because that's a priority for Canadians. That money has allowed us to target 4 jurisdictions per year, Mr. Speaker. That has allowed us to lay charges, and we have been able to hire auditors. Those investments have also allowed us to transfer cases to criminal investigations and to tighten up.
For Brampton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the past 2 budgets saw the government make unprecedented investment in housing. We know this is utmost important and has a great impact on the lives of many Canadians. Could the Minister responsible for housing provide us with an update up to what those investments have achieved so far?
Minister of Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me start by thanking warmly my colleague and our colleague from Brampton Centre for his great work on behalf of his constituents. Our government believes that every Canadian should have access to affordable and adequate housing. Because of this, we have invested historic amounts in the last 2 budgets and will be launching in a few weeks from now the first ever national housing strategy. That will set the stage for the most ambitious demonstration of federal housing leadership in over half a century. That will also set the stage for working with partners. Many of them have been waiting for us for a long time. We're back. We're here to stay.
Here, here. Honourable member for Brantford Grant.
The Liberals talk about not breaking promises. Well, they broke their promise to veterans and they took them back to court. Yesterday, we learned that veterans are being forced to wait longer and longer to get the benefits they earned. And the number of homeless veterans has risen, wait for it, 62% since the Liberals took power. The Prime Minister is in Asia delivering on his priority, $500 million in infrastructure handouts to the world's wealthy. Can the Minister of Veterans Affairs tell us why are veterans getting less while the Prime Minister gives $500 million to wealthy bankers in Asia.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure and Communities.
We have a sacred obligation to our veterans that when they come back broken, we will see that they mend. We demonstrate our belief in this every day through the services and support we deliver to veterans and their families. We remain committed to a pension for life option and will announce further details later in this year, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. We will remember.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil, Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, in a letter sent yesterday to the Federal Minister of Finance, the Quebec government says that it's going to demand that Netflix and web giants be taxed fairly and is calling for the federal government to cooperate. It's a question of tax fairness for our business people in Quebec. All parties agree on that. The Quebec government says that the principle of the sales tax should already apply to these services. I'm not going to put this question to the Minister of Canadian Heritage because she simply abdicated her responsibilities, but to the Minister of Finance. Quebec is standing with its business people. So will the federal government work with Quebec to ensure that web giants pay their fair share for all of society? Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage. We understand the concerns of the Francophone cultural sector. I would like to reassure them and to remind them of the historic investments that we have made to support our Francophone culture. That is why we have invested massively in our culture. That is over $2.2 billion. We reinvested in Francophone television, and we have invested $675 million in Radio-Canada. Those investments have tangible impacts on the lives of our artists.
Glengarry Prescott Russell.
The Honourable Member for Glengarry Prescott.